Welcome to this video tutorial on creating interior perspective drawings in Rhino. This video follows on from my previous video on creating eye-level views in Rhino, and we're going to be using that view to then create an interior perspective drawing using the same model. Now I've got my named views set up here with that view in the previous video that I've made, so we're going to begin by just laying out our windows for the best use to create this drawing. So in this perspective window here, I'm just going to double click on my named view that I've saved to get back to that eye level view that I've set. I'm actually also going to go to my left hand window here, and we're going to set this to a perspective view, and we're going to make sure it's on shaded as well. The reason for this is that I want to use this view to edit the model and kind of adjust any of the geometry, bring in any other assets into here for my view. So we're going to have one view on the right so we can see what the actual image is going to look like, and one on the left which we're going to work within. I'm not going to use the front or the right view that much in these, so I'm actually just going to minimize these downwards just to make the other two slightly bigger. And also I kind of want my eye level view to be a portrait view, so I'm going to actually just extend and change and adjust the sort of frame of this view to get that kind of right orientation and aspect ratio that I'm looking for, which is somewhere around there. So now we've got our kind of window set up, we've got our view which we made within the previous video, and we've got our model that we're going to be working into. Now the first thing I do when I'm sort of setting up eye level views like this is try to compose the view to show the elements that I want to show within the scene. Now we have this interior of a flat in here, and I kind of want to bring in a bit of furniture to sort of bring this to life a bit and showcase what this space would look like if inhabitants were living there. So I've got some stools and a table and chair here which I've actually downloaded from an online source. I'll put a link to that in the description of the video so you can also find sort of other assets like this, and I've just sort of copy and pasted it into the scene, and we're going to just move it into view here. Now what you'll see is I'm moving it around in this left hand window but having a look in the right hand window to see how that sits within my view, and I just want to sort of get it in a nice position that works particularly for this view. I'm not so worried about where it actually sits within the space. I'm purely trying to compose the image on the right hand side, and this is a good technique when you're working with perspective views, particularly with interiors, is that you want to sort of work with the composition of the image. So you're moving objects around, furniture, other pieces to best showcase that space that you're trying to design. So I think around there is a nice position for that table and chairs. If you're having trouble kind of accessing objects inside a space, something you can do is always create a clipping plane just by typing in clipping plane here, drawing this out and using this just in this perspective view to sort of chop into the model. You see it doesn't affect my eye level view, it's just affecting this perspective, and this is controlled in the properties menu. With the clipping plane selected, we can click which views this affects if we want to kind of affect different views. But for now I just want to affect this perspective view so I can actually see inside the model and easily edit it like so. So let's just move that up around there. Now we've got that, I'm actually going to just adjust some of the furniture here. It's very sort of static, it looks like everything's at a perfect sort of 90-degree angle to one another, and I want to make it look a little bit more that it's lived in, or that a stool's kind of just been pulled out from under the table. So we're going to move this one out a little bit. I'm going to adjust this one slightly and this one here just to make it feel a little bit more natural, that they're kind of being placed by humans and they're not sort of perfectly rigid to that table, just to make the whole area feel a bit more lived in. Other techniques I often use with this is to sort of open doors slightly. We can just kind of use the rotate tool here and just spin it off its axis so it looks like the door's slightly open in the background. You can do the same for windows as well if you want a sort of slightly opening window in there. And all of these little techniques can be used to just make a sort of space feel a little bit more lived in rather than a very rigid sort of static object, which can often be the case when you model it straight from Rhino. Now I've got my kind of main composition set up, what I want to now do is sort of start to work in some lighting into the scene to test how the light may affect this view. To do this we're going to be using Rhino's built-in render engine, and this is found up in the render panel here. And we can go first down to current renderer to see which render engine it's using. Now I'm using Rhino 7, which has a kind of new version of the Rhino Render, which can be found here. If you're using Rhino 6 or lower, you'll be using this kind of legacy version of the render. Both of these work, and we're really just using them just to get the shadows from the image. You'll find that the sort of Rhino render might take slightly longer than the legacy as well, which is something to bear in mind. And actually, if you want just very sharp shadows in your scene, sometimes the legacy Rhino render is better to use. So actually, let's use the legacy one for this example. And once we've set that, we're going to go to the render properties to start to adjust how that's going to affect our scene. Now, I just want very simple shadows because we're going to be creating a drawing, not a sort of fully visualized render in here. So for the backdrop, we're just going to set it to a solid color. That can be white for now. For the lighting, we're going to just set it to sun. So we're going to turn off the skylight there and just have the sun set on. And we're going to turn off this custom environment for reflections, like so. Under the sun settings, we're just going to click in here. And we're just going to put that onto manual controls, and this allows me to sort of spin around the sun to any location and also any height in the sky. Now bear in mind, if you have the sun below 0, the sun is actually set, so it will be pitch black, so you usually want to make sure it's around a sort of 40-45 degrees there, so it's a nice kind of high angle in the sky, so we're going to get some good shadows in our space. Now the kind of direction of the sun depends on the axis of your model, and sometimes it's about just picking a direction, testing the lighting and then adjusting it to suit. So now we've set that, we're going to go OK, hit OK again in our render properties here. And once we've done that, we're then going to render out our scene. Now before we do this, I'm just going to save the file, because quite often what happens if you've got a very large file, rendering might take up a lot of processing power, and it's always best to save it before you do this in case your file crashes or you have any kind of unwanted errors that occur during that process, because rendering does take up a lot of your computer power. Something we can do before we hit the render button here is to just go into the view and turn it to a rendered view, and we can see a little preview of what the lighting looks like. And my kind of main aim is to get the light through this sort of side window that I've caused here, and if we sort of move that clipping plane upwards, you can see I've got this sort of shutters in place here, which we want the light to come in and hit this table, which is doing quite well there. If it doesn't quite hit the right angle or you need to adjust it, you can always go back to the render properties, scroll back down to the sun settings and adjust the sun accordingly here, determining the kind of height you want or the angle you want to get that kind of good lighting in your scene. I usually obviously want the sun to be coming from an accurate location that matches where your kind of building is located, but you also want to give it the most dynamic lighting you can for the view you're trying to create. So it's all about just working the angle of the sun to best showcase the view you want. Now what we're going to do, now we've sort of set our lighting up, is we're going to just go to the render panel and hit render to render out that scene, and we can see a kind of accurate rendered version of this view, and here we have it here. And because we're using the Rhino render, it's very sort of black and white. We get a very stark difference between the light areas and the shadow areas in the scene, which is perfect for what we want for this drawing. Now before I start to kind of work up the final drawing of this, I'm going to make a few adjustments just to sort of work up this light and adjust little bits of our scene. Often what I'll be doing if I'm working in a scene such as this is I might render the scene out and then adjust the geometry to kind of best work with the view I'm trying to create. For example, in this, at the moment the ceiling's quite dark in that rendered view, so it might be that I want to start to chop some holes in the ceiling to start to bring in some more light here. So we're going to just put this on rendered view for now, and what I'm going to do is let's just use the box tool here, and we're just going to chop a hole in this ceiling piece to sort of match the window, and let's do it kind of halfway along my geometry like so. Bring it up a bit, and then I'm going to use the Boolean difference tool to subtract that shape from my ceiling like so. And there you can see I've cut that hole in there. Now it's bringing a bit more light into the scene, which is perfect for what I want here. So quite often you might want to make adjustments to your view you're doing based upon the renders you're getting from there, and this is a really good way of using rendering as a tool to help your design and not just a way to sort of showcase a final image. So let's do a quick render of this view again just to test that lighting. And I think I'm quite happy with that now. We're getting a good sort of strong light in from the top and also this nice sort of shutter light in from the bottom. So now we're happy with our final render there. What we're going to do is go back to our render properties, and we're going to kind of up the aspect ratio to give this a slightly kind of more high resolution render. Now I've set my dimensions to custom here, which means I can type in any dimensions I want, and these figures here are linked to a kind of pixel size. So we've got 800 by 1063 pixels at the moment, and we want to make sure this is locked to our viewport aspect ratio, which means it will match the ratio I've given the image in this frame here. So I think let's up this to around 3000, and it should automatically update the height as well. And we're going to set it to 300 dpi, and we'll set it to final quality, which is the sharpest quality we can get in this render. So it's a much higher resolution, which will mean it will take a little bit longer to render out, but this should be fine when we're using Rhino Render, which is usually pretty quick to render out these images. So once we're happy with that resolution, I'm going to hit OK, and then we're going to render out our image just by going to render and then hitting the render button. My image is now fully rendered out, and this took around 10 seconds to do so. So what I'm now going to do is we're just going to save this image out as a JPEG that we can then compile with our drawing as we move forward. We'll do this just by hitting the save icon and just calling this image shadows, like so. Now with that saved, what we're also going to do is we're also going to take a line drawing of this view here, which we're then going to turn into our drawing file, and we're going to link that with the shadow to create our final image. To turn this view into a line drawing, I'm just going to select the objects in this view just by selecting this view and hitting Ctrl A to select all the objects within there. Then we're going to type in make 2D and make sure we're using that eye level view, and just under the make 2D there's a few important settings we need to make sure we're clicking. First, that we're using that view projection. Second, that we're using the source layers, so we maintain those source layers when we're taking out that make 2D. Third, that we're kind of getting that viewport rectangle. We don't need the clipping plane intersection on, and we don't need the group output. So it's just that viewport rectangle which is important, and this will help us line up our shadows with our drawing once we try to compile these two together. So then I'm going to hit OK to create that 2D drawing from my view. And depending on the complexity of your model, this may take a shorter or longer amount of time. Once that's done, we can then find our 2D drawing in the top view. So we're just going to switch our view here to top, zoom out slightly, and there we have our 2D drawing there. What I'm going to do here is we're just going to take that 2D drawing, select the line work and go File, Export Selected, and we're going to export it as an Illustrator file here. Like so. I'm going to call this drawing and hit save. Now I'll ask you how you want to export the drawing. Usually you can do a snapshot of the current view, but if you're working on Mac, sometimes this makes the drawing much larger and you can't see it on your Illustrator file, in which case you might want to preserve the model scale and just make it a scale of 1 to 100. And to do that, you just divide the number on the left by 100. So we do millimeters, and we can do 0.01 there. This should mean that the drawing is small enough to work with on your Illustrator file. So if you're having trouble when you open up the Illustrator file and you can't see it, the reason will be the scale. So always just try and lower the scale down and it should come through there. I'm just going to use a snapshot for this one, and we're going to hit OK to save that drawing. So now we've got those two files. We've got our drawing and our shadows, and we're now going to start to compile these together and work this into our final drawing. To do this, we're going to begin by opening up our drawing file in Illustrator and starting to work into this, adding line weights and adding colour to this drawing. Now we've opened up our drawing in Illustrator, we're going to begin by just selecting the drawing that's coming in and resizing it to match our artboard. We can do this just by holding the Shift key and selecting the top left or right anchors of this image and scaling it up to match the extent of the artboard. Now I'm not going to do this exactly for now because it will be a slightly different aspect ratio to what I have, so I'm just sizing it to roughly match, and then we're going to go to Document Setup, Edit Artboards, and then just zoom in and line up that artboard to snap to the frame of the image like so. And we're just going to snap it to the center point of that line on each of these sides, just checking that that's correctly lined up to that viewport. The reason for this is this will allow us to easily line up our shadows and our line work once we start to compile these images together. The next thing we're going to do is start to work into the line weights on this image. Now, to begin with, I'm just going to select all of my lines here, and you'll notice in my layers panel that they already have layers which will be matching the layers that I had in my Rhino file, which is great because it allows me to easily start to adjust those line weights depending on the object in the scene. Now we're going to begin just by making all the lines black. So with everything selected, I'm just going to hit on this stroke and fill color here to select the stroke. We're going to go up to my colors here and we're going to just make this black. Then we're just going to make the stroke weight a 0.25, which is a nice sort of thin line weight to begin with as we start our scene. Now we want to start to work into certain line weights to start to either kind of raise them up or lower them down depending on the objects that we have. Now I can sort of scroll through my layers here and I've got my railings, which I might want to make a slightly lighter line weight. So just by clicking on the little circle next to the layer, I will select all those objects in that layer and we can then scale that down. Let's put this at a 0.15 to make this slightly slimmer. We might want to make the kind of handrail aspects a little bit thicker so they pop out. It might be that we want certain other bits of structure, like these kind of internal walls, to be slightly thicker as well. And I think I want those to match these walls here. So I'm just going to go around and slightly sort of raise the line weights of some objects to give them a slightly denser hierarchy and lower the line weights of others just to balance out those pieces in the scene. And it's always good to sort of just go through this process asking yourself what's important in your view, what do you really want things to stand out, which things do you want to fall back, and then raise and lower the line weights accordingly for those objects. So I think for now that's kind of fine for my line weights, and we're now going to start to add in some colour into the scene. Now to do this I'm going to be using the Live Paint Bucket tool, which is found over on the left hand menu and it's below the Shape Builder tool. So if you can't see it, you have to click and hold the Shape Builder tool and you can find the Live Paint Bucket below. Now before we start painting this in, I want to get some references for the colours that I want to add into my scene. And to do this, I've collected a series of reference images here which I'm going to be using to help colour tone my images. Now to bring these into my Illustrator file, all I'm going to do is make a new layer here which we're going to call Reference. And in that reference layer, I'm just going to start to drag and drop some of those images in so we can build up our palette. And we're just going to drop them in, scale them down so they're a nice size, and we'll just sit them just off the artboard to the side of the image here. And we're going to then use these images to basically select some colours directly from these to use within my image. So we're kind of taking them from references. It might be from site photography you have, or kind of physical models that you might have made. And we're going to use this to help colour in the image and get a nice sort of overall colour palette for this. Now to start painting in these lines, we're going to just select all of the line works. I'm just going to lock my reference here, like so, and then we're going to scroll down, make a brand new layer at the bottom of my layers panel here. Make sure it's right at the bottom of all these lines, and we're going to call this paint there. In that paint there, what we're going to do is we're just going to go edit and copy these lines here. Then with that paint layer selected, we're going to go edit and paste in place, like so. What this would do is it will make a copy of all my lines and paste them back in exactly the same place on that layer. What this means is I can then lock all of my lines we have in our layers here, and in my paint layer I can then make this into a live paint object just by selecting the Live Paint Bucket and clicking those lines like so. And there you'll see we can now start to fill in elements of this object. Now the reason I've duplicated those lines to make my paint object is it means that I can still go back and adjust the line weights of certain elements without having to kind of break up my live paint object. Now when you make an object a live paint piece, it means that everything's locked together and it's almost grouped as one whole object. So it gets quite difficult to select and adjust single line weights within there, which is why I like to make a copy. What I usually do as well is just remove any line color or weight from this live paint object just by selecting that stroke color in the bottom left and hitting on this no color option, and it will strip that line weight and color from there. And we can check that just by hiding all my layers above, and it should be invisible. You'll see that the live paint object is still there if we select it, but it doesn't have any line weights on, so it's kind of got an invisible line there, and that's because the lines are given by the layers above. Now to start painting in this object, we can then select my live paint bucket tool, and all I'm going to do is hold the Alt key or the Options key if you're on a Mac, pick a colour from my reference colours here and start to fill it in on the scene. And there are a few tricks we can use when using the live paint bucket tool. One is if we click and hold on the paint bucket and drag it around, it will fill in lots of colours as one. Another thing we can do is if we triple click on the image, it will fill everywhere in the same colour, like so. And it's usually good to give a good base colour to an image and then start colouring in on top of that, because you'll find that there'll be some parts which are very tight little pieces to fill in, and you might not get them all if you're doing everything one at a time. So I usually start by giving everything a base colour and then starting to pick some more colours for my scene and working on top of them, like so. And what we're going to do is I'm just going to start to colour things in based upon the objects and the materials that I want to give. So it might be that we want certain pieces of structure to be this nice kind of rich woody tone, so let's kind of fill these in like so. It might be that we want certain details to have a slightly blue tone to them, so maybe these handrails might be a kind of blue tone. And I'm just going to go around and start to kind of fill in each of these colours depending on the sort of materiality and the look I want to give that object. So I'm just going to pause the video and fill in some of those colours now to build up that colour palette using the references I have here. Now I've finished adding in the base colour to that drawing, I'm now going to add a little bit of tone to this, just to give some three-dimensionality to this drawing. How I'm going to do this is we're just going to use the live paint bucket tool again. I'm going to pick one of the colours I've already added in, say this orange here, and then just under the colour swatch we're just going to double click to open up the colour picker, and we're just going to either darken or lighten that colour slightly. And for this I think I'm going to just lighten it a little bit, like so, just by moving it just to the left and upwards slightly to get a slightly lighter variation of that colour. Then what we can do is just start to fill in faces that face in the same orientation, that lighter tone. So you see I'm just kind of taking faces that are facing in that sort of left hand direction and just filling them in that lighter tone there. And what this would do is it would just add a little bit of three-dimensionality to these pieces to make it feel like they've got a bit more sort of a 3D feel to them. We can do that to other colours as well, or we can give a kind of darker side, so it might be with this orange. I give a slightly darker tone too, and we fill it in accordingly on this side. And it's good to kind of keep a consistency to how you're doing this, so every object that faces left is lighter and the ones that face right are darker, for instance. And you just want to do this to a few pieces just to give a bit of variation to the colours and start to create slightly more dynamic colour tones, so it feels like there's some light and there's some shadow in the scene. Now we're going to kind of combine this with a shadow layer afterwards as well, so all of these will just build up that effect and make it feel a little bit more three-dimensional as you go ahead. So we're just going to kind of do this to a couple more objects here. Now once you've done this, what we can then do is we're also going to start to just take away any things that are sky in the background. And to do this I'm actually just going to set my paint bucket to a non-fill here, so you see just hitting this none button to make sure my fill is kind of completely blank, and then we're just going to use it to sort of strip away the colour. Now it will look like I'm painting it in white, but actually what it's doing is it's showing the artboard behind. And a good way to test this out is you can always make a layer at the very back, like here. I'm going to call this background, like so. And then what I'll usually do is let's just make a kind of blue box or something, and we can just move this around behind, and there you can see it through those windows there. So we're basically giving them a kind of blank texture. And this is quite important when we want to add in a sky afterwards, so we want to just make sure that anywhere that's sort of supposed to be showing sky is doing so just by stripping away that texture there. And I'm just going to go around and just sort of strip it away in these places. You'll notice here where my railings are, it's going to be really fiddly to get all of those lines. Sometimes it's easier just to take away all of that and then fill back in the places you need, like so. So it's sometimes easier to sort of strip away and fill back in rather than kind of painting everything separately, like so. So I'm just going to kind of go ahead and do that, and then we're going to kind of finish off and start to combine the shadows in this video. I've now finished taking away that background pieces from my view, and I'm happy with the colours that I've given this. So what we're going to do now is we're going to start to combine this with the shadow layer that we rendered out in Photoshop. To do this, we're just going to save our drawing, and then we're going to export it by going to File, Export, and Export As here. And we're essentially going to export it as a PNG image, and make sure we click this Use Artboards to lock it to that artboard aspect ratio. Now the reason we're using PNG is it will kind of give us that transparency where we've cut out the windows, which will allow us to easily add a background in if we want to this image. So now I've done that, I'm going to hit Export, and then we're going to just export it as a high resolution PNG and make sure the background's on transparent, and we're going to hit OK there, like so. And now we've exported that, we're now going to combine the two images together in Photoshop. Now we've opened up Photoshop, we're going to begin by just selecting our kind of colored drawing that we did in Illustrator and just opening up that image in our top bar here, like so. And you can see there it's brought in that transparency from the background. Now to combine this with the shadow, all we need to do is take that shadow layer, drop it on top of my image, like so. And they should automatically match because we've matched up those two aspect ratios in both of the files there. Now to overlay those shadows onto my image, we need to then just set the blending mode of the shadows from a normal to a multiply and just lower that fill color down, like so. Now what I usually do is just aim for somewhere that gives me slightly kind of dynamic shadows, like so. So we're getting a good sort of light and shadow contrast in the image there. What I usually like to do as well is just tint the colour of the shadows, because they're kind of rendered out as black and white. It makes the image quite moody, and actually I quite like the shadows to be a slight tone of blue sometimes, just to sort of brighten things up. To do that, we can just go to our adjustment layers in the bottom right, go to Hue Saturation, hold the Alt key between the shadow layer and the hue saturation, and what this will do is it will clip that shadow to that hue, so the hue saturation is just affecting that shadow layer. Then we can go on Colorize, make sure it's sort of on a blue tone, like so. And what I'm going to do is we'll just set this to normal for now, just so we can clearly see this working. Up the lightness slightly and up the saturation, and then we're just going to vary this till we get a nice sort of tone of blue somewhere around there, and then we'll put it back on and multiply and lower that fill color down again. And all this would do is it would just sort of make it slightly less gloomy and give a little bit of a colour tint to that shadow layer. Now to finish this drawing off, we might want to add in a kind of colour for the background, or even a sort of sky for that. You can do this just by creating a new layer below your colour layer. I've just got a series of skies here, and we're just going to drag and drop one onto my scene, scale it up to match that window, so we've got a bit of cloud in the top there. And then we just want to match up the colours and the atmosphere of this to match the rest of my image. So to do that, I'm going to go back down to my adjustment layers, use a hue saturation to slightly lower the saturation of the sky and up the brightness, just to make sure it's sort of looking like it's kind of faded out in the scene there. And then I'm going to use a couple of filters just to adjust the look of that sky. One of these I'm going to use in the filter gallery, which is the cutout filter, and this just kind of creates a slightly sort of cut out look to the sky to match the sort of more postery look that I'm given. We can always sort of adjust the simplicity of this to reduce the kind of complexity of those clouds to match the scene, and I think somewhere like that works quite well. So you can see there it sort of simplified them down slightly. And I sometimes also use the kind of stylize and the oil paint filter on this just to soften up the edges of that cloud, like so as well. And we can always kind of fade it a little bit just by upping that brightness, like so. And I think I'm kind of happy with it there. So there you have a kind of quick tutorial on creating a sort of interior perspective drawing in Rhino using Illustrator and Photoshop to kind of combine those two views together. We can always finish this off with a slight sort of crop to properly sort of line up the view and focus it in on the areas of importance, like so. But hopefully you found this video tutorial useful, and if you want to watch any other videos on creating drawings, textures or renders in Rhino and Photoshop, please check out the videos on the channel.